Uh, so Dr. Eros Sapit is a senior lecturer at the Department of Marketing, International Business and Tourism, Faculty of Business and Law at Manchester Metropolitan University, UK. Dr. Eros is listed in the Stanford and Elsevier top 2% scientists for the fifth time from 2020 to 2024, and also Scholar GPS with a highly ranked scholar in the tourism in recognition of the exceptional productivity as well as not only impact and also quality of scholarly work in the top 0.05% of the scholars in the field of tourism worldwide. He is also ranked 81 out of 9,676 authors in the field of the in the subfield of sports, leisure, tourism. Dr. Eros is a prolific researcher and had developed the note or the critical mass of outputs in the field of consumer behavior in tourism and also globally recognized. He has also worked in high-profile UK collaborators and also range of international collaborators, as well as enjoys prominent standing within the field of tourism, hospitality, and leisure. So he also served as the editorial board for the several international peer-reviewed journals, and also the regional editor for the Europe for the International Journal of Tourism Research, and also associate editor for the Leisure or the Leisure Sciences Journal of Islamic Marketing. His global recognition of research excellence also evidenced through the honorary positions in the field of hospitality tourism, and also international universities or membership research groups, and also professional bodies, including University of Eastern Finland in Finland, right? So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Dr. Eros to continue his delivery. Thank you very much, Dr. Eros, for being with us at the School of Hospitality, Tourism and Events and Taylor's University. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Rupam. So warm welcome to everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to be here for the research seminar. So just talking about what I'll be covering in this particular research seminar is talking about my research, that is the research agenda, what I've covered or done research in 2024, what I'm currently working on with colleagues around the world in terms of research. I'll share a bit of teaching interest, that teaching that I do here, because I personally feel that teaching does not substitute research. It has to go parallel. So as a doctoral student, postdoctoral researcher, I feel that it's really important that you should also take on the role of doing some teaching. So I'll cover that aspect, and I'll deep dive into tips for writing quality papers. So I hope that my top tips, my subjective views will be helpful for you in your writing style, as well as in the submission process. Okay, so moving on. So in this, as I mentioned previously, in this research seminar, what I'll cover is the research agenda. That's my own research, teaching interest, a bit more detailed, tips on providing tips for writing quality papers. And something that I'll focus on is, giving my view as an editor or associate editor for different journals. I review multiple papers. I used to review, I think last year, almost 120, 150 papers a year for different journals, spanning from, tourism, hospitality. So I'll give you that view in terms of, what you should do, what you shouldn't do in terms of avoiding desk reject and getting your paper through towards the peer review process, and also give you my perspective as an author, publishing different articles in different journals. And I'm happy to answer any questions. There will be time for Q&A. Right, so moving on, as Dr. Rupam already introduced me, I'll just briefly introduce myself to those that do not know me. I do supervise and have supervised PhD students at Taylor's University. It has been a fantastic experience. My name is Eros Sapit. If you need to be in contact with me, that's the email address, my official man-made email address. You can send in emails with your queries. I'm more than happy to help you. I'm a senior lecturer here at the Manchester Metropolitan University. Our department is called Department of Marketing, International Business and Tourism, and I particularly focus on the tourism part. So that's my core area of research. I've done my PhD from Finland, focusing on consumer behavior in tourism in 2018. I've also done my master's thesis linked to tourism research. So my background is very much related to tourism. And in terms of my research interest, something that I'm known for, something that I generate a lot of citations is memorable tourism experiences. So that's the research area that I focus on. And other areas that I've done research recently is interactive value formation, particularly value co-destruction and sharing economy, focusing on primarily Airbnb. So that was a short introduction about myself. As Dr. Rupam already mentioned previously, I'm listed for the fifth time in the top 2% Stanford's top scientist list, and that is something that is based on my track record and academic merit. There's also Scholar GPS. So in terms of that ranking, I'm actually ranked 29th in the world based on my track record for the past 5 years when it comes to tourism research. And in the UK, I'm ranked top 3 when it comes to the field of tourism. So a bit about my academic background and latest publication track record and those under review. I consider myself to be highly research active. I've worked with researchers, postdoctoral researchers from different universities, even PhD students currently I'm working with. I've published papers with also master students that I've worked with. So if you look at the track record, I've published about 10 papers in 2022. Moving forward, I've maintained that consistency. 2023 was about 11 articles. Last year was, again, a big number. I collaborated a lot, did a lot of research. I had 29 publications in 2024. And this year, I've already published uh, 11 articles, 2025. I recently got a paper accepted with a PhD student that has finished her studies at Taylor's University in IJCHM. It's a very good journal, ABS 3. And in terms of my publication, since I started my PhD and until now as a senior lecturer, I've published about 87 articles. And my idea or my plan is to publish, I think that number would get around 100 by the end of this year. So a bit of my publication track record. Again, as I said previously, I'm open to collaboration with, range of, people working with me, whether that's PhD students, postdoctoral researchers, whether we have lecturers, senior lecturers. I'm open to collaboration. So please do reach out if my area of research relates to yours. Right. In terms of the type of articles that I've published, the topics, the journals, a brief introduction about what I've done so far. So as I said, the core area of my research is related to memorability, memorable tourism experience. So I've highlighted that in bold. So I've published papers on memorable digital tourism experiences, wine tourism experiences. I also focused on the negative part because I personally believe that the memorable tourism experience literature is a bit biased because we believe that personally what I believe also myself is that memorable experiences are not only positive but they can also be negative. So in order to have a holistic understanding, we need to focus on both. So we've done a paper in tourism management perspectives, which we focus on negative memorable food, drink, and culinary tourism experiences, looking at tourists, their negative experience when it comes to gastronomy. Other research that we have done is experience-scape and destination attractiveness. I've also done research related to colleagues from India focusing on customer satisfaction and shopping mall food courts. What is it that contributes to satisfaction in that context? Also with colleagues from Iran, where we looked at visual narratives and the tourist gauge. How is it that the tourist view the destination based on the pictures that they take. So we've used the visual narratives and pictures actually in the analysis itself. Then we have touched upon the looking at the post-pandemic, how to revitalize the hotel industry area. These were with colleagues from Brazil. And also looking at wellness spa experience. This was with a group of colleagues and researchers from Serbia. Right. Moving on, I've also then touched upon other aspects of research topics last year, focusing on domestic tourists, memorable tourism experiences, whether that's within the context of heritage tourism. Uh, Also, I've done research linked to halal food experience that is which varies, I believe is quite popular nowadays. And other areas that I've done research is wildlife tourism with colleagues from Ghana. We did this research in a national park. And then another research that I found really interesting was whale watching tourism experience, looking at what makes the experience memorable for people going for a whale watching trip. This was based in Portugal. We got the data from there and had the opportunity to collaborate with colleagues from Portugal. I've also done research with other colleagues from Brazil, looking at tour call, that's assessing visitor attractions. So those are some examples of the research that I've covered last year that I did with colleagues from different parts of the world. And this year, as I mentioned, I've published about 11 papers so far. Others are under review, and in different high-ranking journals. They are, I believe, they are Q1, and some of them are in the ABS ranking as well, except for a few that are in Q2 and Q3. So this year, what we have done is I've had the opportunity to collaborate with researchers on different interesting topics, whether that's artificial intelligence and looking at how it impacts hotel service performance. I believe it's a hot topic. A lot of papers, being published in that area. One of the research that I did was impulsive buying in live streaming marketing. Again, looking at other research that I did was tourist fresh mindset in terms of destination marketing. So, people visiting destinations to have that fresh start, revitalizing, refreshing themselves. Another interesting research that I did was smart hotels and also looking at creative flow in doctoral education. So, what is it that leads to creativity of students in doctoral education? So now we have, the Chat GPT, we have AI, we have different tools. But again, how can students maintain creativity in doctoral education? A really interesting research with a doctoral student. From Turkey and a colleague of mine, where we looked at that process itself. Right. So moving on, I'll talk about two research that I've done that I found really interesting. There is scope for, and then there is very little research being done. So there is again room to contribute to that area of research. On the left hand side, you can see that the paper was about digital free tourism experiences. It's also called detox tourism. So what does it really mean when it comes to detox tourism? Is traveling when you can actually step out from using these digital devices, temporarily withdrawing from them completely, and experiencing that the on-site travel itself, not engaging with any kind of mobile phones or internet and staying away from them. Really interesting research. Very few people papers have been published in this area. So I would, if somebody is interested, you can definitely contribute to that area of research. So what we did in that research is, with my colleagues from China and United States, is we looked at what is it that makes the experience memorable when it comes to detox tourism. So we were able to find some construct that contributed to memorability, and also looking at how it contributes to um, well-being, hedonic well-being, eudaimonic well-being, also place attachment. So something that we found based on our analysis was memorability did contribute to those dependent variables. On the right hand side, you can see another article that I published with the colleagues of mine from China, Australia, and the UK. And this is on the other extreme. So on the left hand side, you have detox tourism, and on the right hand side, you have unmanned smart hotels. It's a hotel experience where everything is done using technology. So there might be very less human contact. So if you look at the left hand side, I think this one is again the other extreme, where you check into the hotel, everything is digitized. You get the keys, you check in, you have the robot butlers coming in taking your order. So there is very almost none when it comes to human interaction when being in that the hotel itself. So we did this study in a smart hotel based in China, unmanned smart hotel, also trying to see what is it that contributes to the memorability of people staying at this Flyzhou hotel in China. So very interesting research. Again, as I mentioned previously, there is a lot of room to contribute to this existing literature because there is very little existing research being done in this part, in this field of topic, I would say. Moving on, so something that I also like to cover is, as I mentioned previously, something that I also do is uh, include my research as part of the teaching that I do. So, as a module leader or course leader, I lead 4 different courses. That is, the first one is tourism destination fieldwork, where I take students on a fieldwork to different countries. I've taken students to New York. Last year, this year, we went to Greece, Athens, where our students did field work. Another research that module that I lead or course that I lead is understanding the customer experience. I also teach level 7, that's master's students on 2 different courses called International Tourism Destination, as well as Tourism and Hospitality Futures, as well as supervise undergrad or bachelor's and master's students here at Manchester Met. So how do I actually, um, inform my teaching based on my research is, I actually print out these articles. I share my articles with my students to get an understanding of when, what does it mean when it comes to doing a qualitative research, when it comes to doing qualitative research. What is a research gap? How can you, identify a research gap in an article? How do you respond, or how do you identify the justification or so what question? What are the theoretical implications? What are managerial implications? How do you go about writing the method section? So this really helps in the sense to get them of good foundation to do good research, whether that's a level 6 a research project or dissertation, whether that's the level 7 master's thesis. So really trying to help them to get an understanding to go about doing their own research, because they need to complete their 30 ECTS in order to graduate, whether that's from a bachelor's degree or whether with a master's degree. Some pictures. So those are my students from the previous cohort. It's an international group. They are my master's students working in different groups, and I use a lot of active learning strategies, and this is one of them. My cohort, I think it ranges about 30 to 35 students in a semester. So we have 2 semesters. So these are my students from last cohort. Right. In terms of thesis supervision, something that I also like to cover is I'm currently supervising 10 undergrad students, 2 master's students. I have 3 PhD completions, and I'm also supervising as a co-supervisor. I have 10 PhD students, including those from Taylor's University. I'm working closely with Dr. Rupam in that area where we are supervising PhD students from Taylor's University. And I've had the opportunity to also publish, as I mentioned, I publish their research, whether as PhD students, whether even master students. So if you look at the article on the right hand side that was published in IJCHM, it's a Q1 journal. It's a highly ranked ABS3 hospitality journal. So we had the opportunity to work with the student from University of Eastern Finland, Jere. So his work, the master's thesis, we got the opportunity to work with him and then publish it in a very high-ranking journal. So there is a possibility. So if you do quality work, you can get in touch with your supervisors. I'm more than happy to collaborate as well to get your research out there in high-ranking journals. So here are 2 other examples. These are again 2 examples of master students, not PhD, and that we got the opportunity to work with and got the research published. On the left-hand side, it's Laser Studies, again, a good journal. And on right-hand side, we got this paper published about sustainability communication, a link to, booking or cottage holidays. So we are looking at, how people book these cottage holidays based on the information they receive. So one scenario was where there is sustainability communication information included in the advertisement, And on the other example, they were nothing related to sustainability communication. So very interesting finding. We got it published in Scandinavian Journal of Hospitality and Tourism, really high-ranking journal. Again, so this is an example of PhD students that I work with. On the left-hand side, we got this paper published in Service Marketing Quarterly. It was about co-created caring in chat-based customer service. So how do these, how is value co-created in that chat-based service when people are seeking for information and trying to get help from this online customer service provider? And on the right-hand side, this is a paper with the PhD student Joma and colleagues, including Dr. Rupam, that we got published in Journal of Hospitality and Tourism Insights. So I believe it's a PhD work that we have had the opportunity to get it published and get it out there uh, as a form of publication. Right. In terms of teaching philosophy, as I mentioned previously, if you are a PhD student, if you are a postdoctoral researcher, if you are a lecturer, I would suggest, my, high recommendation or suggestion would be like, to do some teaching. That is something that I did as a PhD student, as a postdoctoral researcher, because you really need that experience when you go in the job market. You can't be competing only with research, because when you go for the job interview, something that they ask me is, okay, you're great, you're doing fantastic research, but what about the teaching side? Teaching side does not substitute research. So you can't say that I'm a good researcher and then, I'm just starting to get a feel about the teaching. That shouldn't be the case. So something that I suggest my students here as well is, get that experience, even if you can do guest lectures, teaching assistant, helping your professors to do a few lectures and getting that feel of, of teaching. That is really, really important. So I've completed my teaching degree from two different universities, one here at Manchester Met, another from Haaga-Helia based in Finland. And I've got this qualification for my teaching, and something that I practice is called student-centered learning approach. And I've also used technology to help the, better or, gain or help provide better teaching and learning experience for my students. So the student-centered learning approach, what it does is, what it focuses on is the focus is on the learner. It's the students that is the center of the attention. It's not the teacher. It is not me that is in the center of the attention. So it is not me at all, So I would consider myself as a facilitator of learning. Okay, so that is what I consider myself. It is very active, there is active involvement of my students involved in group activities, in interacting with me. Also in my lectures, I interact with all my students, get them to answer questions, give their views. So it's not passive at all. So this is not passive learning. So I involve, technology to get them engaged. So student-centered learning is very, very, focused towards the students and their needs. So it gives them a lot of autonomy in terms of the activity that they do. You can answer questions, you can, engage in group activities. Also, we have both lectures and seminars, so they are actively involved. So that is something that I expect, and I, highly engage with my students throughout the semester. So here are some pictures from the courses that I teach. I use Bloom's taxonomy. That is again related to how I design my courses to promote and focus on student-centered learning. And on the left-hand side, you can see students tapping on the screen. That's a multi-sensory room. So in one of the courses that I teach, understanding the customer experience, we teach about the 4 E's of experience economy. The Pine and Gilmore have introduced that. So you can see that it is not only about looking at literature about 4 E's also, but also engaging in that multi-sensory room. So those entertainment and education are the components of 4 E's. So you can actually look at videos, have a sensory experience, and engage with the concepts and theories that the students are learning in that course. And I also bring in a lot of guest lectures and industry practitioners in my semester. So on the right hand side below, I have Professor Mihalis coming in for a guest lecture for my session. He's an expert in place branding. So he shares his insights to my students, and then if their master's thesis is related to place branding, place marketing, he could probably be the supervisor for them for their master's thesis. I do a lot of field trips, as I mentioned previously, as part of my modules to get them actively engaged. So on the left-hand side, that's a picture from Man City Stadium where students go and engage and do their observations, write field notes, and then that's part of their assessment. On the bottom, those pictures are from a recent trip to Greece. So my students, level 5 bachelor students, we went there and all of my students had to observe the impacts of tourism. So that was a field trip that we spent 5 days in Greece. On right hand side, we also engage, technology in making that learning experience really fruitful and hands-on for our students. So you can see the students using VR glasses as part of one of our courses, where they actually get to engage with the content using technology. Okay. Right. So moving on to the other half. So as I mentioned previously, I'll be providing you 5 top tips for writing quality papers. So these are my subjective views. So you might have other people saying, giving or sharing other ideas, but these are my subjective views based on my experience as a researcher. As an author, as an editor or associate editor for multiple journals, and as a reviewer, as I said, I review about more than 100 papers in a year from multiple journals. I think it would be about 20 plus journals. So sharing that my insights into how to really publish those quality papers of yours and getting there. So fine tuning them. So my first tip is conducting good research. So in order to provide or in order to do quality research, you have to do quality. In order to publish quality papers, you have to do good research. So what does that really mean? Is research that matters to end users, research that contributes to has solid theoretical implications, advances knowledge, whether there is, it contributes to education and as well as the real world. So there has to be that conducting good research and contributing to these multiple areas or even one areas. That should be the main focus, because something that I've also experienced as a reviewer nowadays is you get these papers that are being sent in, and then something that I see is they are basically heavy on the method part. They have no contribution to the real world. They are simply testing the existing scale in a different setting. So that is again big no. So that is that's a red flag for me as an associate editor, as a reviewer. So something that I would suggest is really have a thought through this whole process when you are writing the paper, that it has to have that solid contribution, whether that's theoretical, managerial. So that's the starting point, my top tip. Second tip that I would like to give is as a author, as an associate editor, as a reviewer, there are 3 things that I actually look into. And nowadays more and more I've seen things or papers moving away from this. The first thing that I would say is clearly stating the research gap supported by recent existing literature. So as I said, as I review these different papers, something that I found more and more is sometimes you get these papers that goes directly into the setting. This research is then done in this area, to do this and that, but there is no explicit mention of the research gap. So what is the research gap that you are trying to address? It has to be clearly stated in the introduction section. And I would suggest something that to all the audience today is try to cite recent existing literature, because something that I found many times is people cite studies from 2000, 2001, 1990s, and it seems that they have very little knowledge of what's happening in that area in recent years. So cite studies, something that I also suggest my students here as master students or PhD students, is look at seminal studies, fine, from 1980s, 1990s, but also look at the studies that are happening 2022, 2023, 24, 25, so that you are aware of what's happening. So you have to cite recent studies when you provide that or state that research gap of yours in that paper. There has to be originality. That is something that is required, and I believe in all types of journals, whether that's Q1, Q2, Q3, or even ABS 1, 2, 3, or 4, where there has to be this solid originality. It can't be just testing a model in a new location or industry. That's not enough. You have to add in your new perspective, And something that I also would like to highlight is, many at times, what authors do is they actually rush into writing that section called theoretical contribution. So many a times what happens is this rejections or papers get rejected where the theoretical contribution is not solid. So that's a very important part of an article, which I believe should be spent time, dedicated in writing that solid section. How does your findings or results contribute to the existing literature? Does it extend the theory? Does it have a new implications, theoretical implications for existing literature? So that part should be very very solid. So that's one of the reasons that I've seen that papers being rejected, because they are very weak on the theoretical contribution side, although they are very heavy on the method part. So my suggestion would be to focus on this part as much as possible when you handing your research to a particular journal. Another thing that my top tip would be like focusing on the relevance. It's not that I'm not saying that don't focus on the rigor part. Rigor is important as well, but you also need to focus on the relevance, the significance, and wider value of your study, the so what question. So you need to address that question early on in the introduction section. It needs to be taken seriously. It has to be clearly stated. It has to be compelling, not only informative, also has to be impactful. So the introduction section, as I mentioned previously, should contain the background, followed by the research gap that is supported by the existing, recent existing literature. Then comes your aims and objectives, including research question. But also you should answer the so what question. Why is your study, important, or why is your study even needed in the first place? You should answer that so what question in the very introduction section, so that the reviewer gets an understanding of the significance and wider value of your study. And also you need to provide a justification of why you are doing this study. Give a couple of lines, write a couple of lines explaining that. So my third tip would be focus on not only the rigor, but also to focus on the relevance. The reason that I'm saying that is I get a lot of papers that are very heavy on the analysis part, on the method part, and they are very very light when it comes to the relevance itself. How is it making an impact? How is it contributing to existing literature? So that is my third tip. The fourth tip that I would suggest is focusing on critical literature review. I have my students coming up to me with their literature review, whether that's bachelor's, master's, PhD students, even postdoctoral. And something that I tell them is, do not cite anything and everything in your literature review and you see a single citation there that adds no value to your study. So what I would suggest is starting from today, I would request everybody to build that habit of doing critical literature review in doing your PhD, writing of your PhD thesis, in the writing of your first article, or the manuscript that you are writing. So the thing is citing the most relevant and significant recent research is linked to critical literature review. So not including everything that may be relevant. So that is my suggestion to all. That should be the starting point. So it should discuss and evaluate, because whenever I'm reading these master thesis, PhD thesis, or even articles, something that I see is very descriptive. It discusses and evaluates research, that is good, but and many times what it does, it simply summarizes, study X did this, study Y did this, rather than having that critical view. So you should critically synthesize information from different sources, and also give your opinion or voice out that criticality in the critical literature review section. Okay. And something that I also found in many articles that I review is there are a lot of um, I would say there are a lot of opinions that are being shared rather than facts. There are no intake citations for the for different sections. For example, the research gap, there's a research gap so and so, but it's not supported by existing literature. So you have to have intake citation to back it up. Okay. So being mindful of time, so just two examples of the significance of critical literature review. I'm sure you'll find this in books. You can, whether that's you can get a hard copy or ebook. You can actually look at the significance of critical literature review. So if you look at the left hand side, there's a picture showing, once you have selected your topic and once you are in the process of developing your conceptual framework, the step two itself is doing critical literature review. So you can see the significance that it informs the following steps: 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it's not about doing literature review, but doing critical literature review. And on the right hand side, you can see that again, it covers different aspects of your research, from the research problem to the analysis part. So you can see the significance of doing critical literature review. So, if you haven't started yet, I would highly suggest, start doing that critical literature review when you start to write or, start to do your new study. Okay. Uh, I'll skip this part and I'll focus on this particular part is, uh, so here's a diagram showing what you shouldn't do when it comes to doing critical literature review. So something that I've found with my students is, they search for and they obtain literature, and immediately what they are doing is they are reading, noting, and, starting to reference that literature without, even critically evaluating the usefulness of that research. You really have to go to that second step before you move on to, citing that literature in that, paper of yours or the manuscript or the PhD thesis of yours. So you have to have that evaluation of the usefulness. Okay. So what do I actually mean by, evaluating the usefulness of literature? Okay. So it says usefulness of research item will depend on your research question and is informed by aims and objectives. But the way you can, evaluate the usefulness of the literature depends on two interrelated aspects. The first one is relevance. How appropriate or, is that research linked to your own research, and how, what connections can you make, with your own research as well. So that's relevance, but also value. So there has to be this, the value, the quality of the research, the rigor part should be solid. So that's the reason I tell my students, rather than going to Google Scholar, please use these different databases when you download your articles. For example, Science Direct, whether that's Emerald Insight, Taylor and Francis, where you get these, peer-reviewed articles, rather than randomly, using keywords and using Google Scholar, where you might land up with articles that are not even peer-reviewed. So you should be very careful with the quality of, the research that you are citing. Okay. Right. So when you evaluate the usefulness of literature, as I mentioned, you need to look at the relevance and value. So here are some questions that you can ask yourself when you, refer to that literature, or when you even download that article and start to look for it. So um, the first questions that you can ask is the research item recent? Don't go on to cite studies from 2000, 2001, 2002. That's something that I suggest my students is cite recent studies. Is the topic relevant to that of yours? Is it referenced? Is there a criticality in that research article where, researchers are contradicting or supporting the argument that you make? What is the writer or the author saying that is relevant to you? So that piece of research has to be relevant for you to cite in order to do your own research. Okay, so those are some questions that you can ask yourself in assessing the relevance of the, literature that you will be citing. Right. So there again, you can ask set of questions when evaluating the value of the literature of the article that you have downloaded. So, for example, does the author use sound and logical arguments based on existing literature? My suggestion would be do not cite literature where there is a lot of opinions being there that is not backed by existing literature. So be very careful. Do they explain, in sufficient detail the theory that they are using? Another something that I would also suggest is the method used, described clearly, because something that I've seen in recent days, especially with the quality papers, the researchers claim to be doing thematic analysis, but there is no, they haven't mentioned the steps. There is no evidence of coding that whatsoever that they have done, and it becomes a desk reject. So when you are downloading that article, have a look of how solid that method part is, and whether or not they suggest, uh, the suggestions for future research, and whether or not there are, list of references being mentioned at the end. So these are some questions that you can ask yourself in terms of assessing the value of that piece of literature that you will be citing in your own research. Okay. Right. My fifth or the last tip would be like, do not rush. I have seen some people really rush into, especially PhD students, even master students, and the articles that I review is really rushing into, at the end when it comes to the practical implications and future research. So let's say if the theoretical implications section is 3 paragraphs, when I read the, article, the managerial implication part is just, couple of lines. I think something that I would really suggest everybody is devote time in writing that solid managerial implications. It shouldn't be abstract, it shouldn't be vague, but it should be very solid. What is it that these stakeholders can gain, or im, implement based on your findings or the results of the study? It has to be clearly stated and actionable with examples. At times, papers get rejected because they have very few to contribute when it comes to managerial implications. Also, something that I look at is, not only the stating the limitations, but also providing concrete suggestions for future research. What is it that future research can do that you haven't done in your own research? That should be clearly stated. Okay, so those were my 5 top tips, but here are some minor tips when you are submitting your paper. So what I would suggest is something that I've experienced with my, with my students and researchers that I've worked with, if you get a rejection, do not go on to submit it to another journal on the same day, without even looking at the aims and the scope of the targeted journal. That shouldn't be the idea, because as an editor or associate editor, they would know, in the first glance that this paper does not actually link to the aims and what's the scope of the journal. So you'll probably get a text reject. So please review that author guidelines when submitting your article to a particular journal. Something that I also suggest is do not use AI irresponsibly or unethically. That should be a big no-no. So if you use AI, it should be declared. I think there's a button when you submit a paper, and also clearly stating that if you have used that, it should be done responsibly. Proofreading your work is very important. I've received a lot of papers where the readability is very poor. Although it's a minor thing, it does affect the readability. So do put yourself in the place of a reviewer trying to assess the readability. You can't be having typographical errors, multiple errors in that piece of paper. And my last suggestion would be to practice good scholarship. So what I mean by practicing good scholarship is, being very transparent and being very ethical about your research. So, if you submit papers to high-ranking journals, they will probably ask you, the first question that the editor might uh, shoot at you is, have you got ethical approval for your research? And if you have, tick that box. Yes, you should be able to submit your, the ethical approval decision letter. So, that's just one example of being ethical. For example, if you do pilot study, in many papers, I see that, people have said that they do a pilot study and they do not mention what changes have been done in the questionnaire. Please explain in the paper that the pilot study has been done and minor changes have been done in the manuscript. What are those minor changes? Also, when you write the sampling technique, why did you use convenience sampling? You have to provide justification. You have to provide justification about theoretical saturation. So these should be clearly stated. For example, if somebody is using Amazon MTurk, and if you have given rewards or some kind of compensation, it also should be mentioned. So being very transparent is really important when doing research, and stating that in that article of yours or the manuscript is part of practicing good scholarship. So those were my minor suggestions or tips for you to write quality papers. Right, Dr. Rupam, I think I'm done. I'm more than happy to take in any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eros. Uh, any questions from the students? If you have any questions, you can put in the chat box, or if you want to open up your mic and speak, you can. Right, Dr. Edos, while they're asking the questions, I just have
Mm-hmm.
two questions for you.
Mm-hmm.
One of the biggest challenge, what I noticed that students coming to, doing PhD or doing research-based program is
Mm-hmm.
coming from a field where they are, not really research oriented. Let's say they haven't done the research in their bachelor's or master's, but they want
Mm-hmm.
to do PhD. What kind
Mm-hmm.
of tips do you think that would be useful for them? What do you think from your viewpoint, uh, students coming from non-research background? Yeah.
I can give you my own experience because here at Manchester Met, we have had cases of master's students. I mean, I'll give you an example, starting with masters, so it helps with the PhD students as well. So we have had 300, 200 students, for example, and 50 of the 50 students had no idea of how to write a bachelor's thesis. And they had, no, it was a big of a struggle for them to write a master's thesis as well. So I can understand the struggle that students, PhD students might have. So what I would suggest is, building that solid foundation from the very beginning. So something that I would suggest is not rushing through. I've seen some students really trying to reach the final line, but I tell them that you need to actually, please, you can't be rushing it so fast. You have to, it's a process. So if you have, all the PhD students and postdoc students here, what I would suggest is enjoy that process. You have to enjoy that whole process of being a, doctoral students and understanding, going from the basic. So my suggestion would be going from the very basic. For example, what's a research topic? How do you actually come up with a research topic? So my suggestion is starting it with critical literature review, because when you do critical literature review, you already have a solid, base, and you know what's being done, or what's been carried out in the area of research. So they can, come up with an idea, have a discussion with the supervisor. Okay, it's AI and something that I'm, interested in doing research. So doing critical literature review, coming up with a solid topic, it might change during the research process, but it will be important to keep it steady, and then going on to understand what is a research aim. Some students do come to me and they have no clue what a research aim is. What is research objectives, what is research questions. So you need to have basic understanding. I would suggest that. And even moving, I think in order to even think about, whether I'll do quantitative or quality study, I tell my students that's a far away thing that you are actually discussing. So hold on, you need to, show me the evidence of the literature review that you have done. Show me the Excel sheet or the piece of, the paper where you have the different sources, what they have researched, what's the research gap. Some students come up to me, they say that they are interested in this topic. I tell them, have you found a research gap that you are addressing? So it's really, really important, especially at PhD level when they have their viva. I think as an examiner, external examiner or examiner, something that I will look at is the research gap supported by existing literature, and whether or not it's solid. They have to understand and gain an understanding of research aim, research objectives, and it's the research questions that inform the choice of, doing qualitative or quantitative study. Because I've had students, they say that they are exploring this and that, and they say that they are doing a quantitative study, and at the end they send me their interview guide. So I think that there is seriously something wrong. So I tell them, please spend a month going to the library, reading research related books, so you get an understanding of what's a qualitative and what's a quantitative study. Yeah, yeah. I hope I answered your question. Yeah.
Sure. Uh, I think one of the issue what we face here, especially at Taylor's, I think you also supervise few of the students here. Um,
Mhm.
One of the major issue is, students having this understanding, how can I write like this? How can I publish like this? Write this
Mhm.
and read
Mhm.
papers and say like, okay, how can I reach there? So what do you say to those students who are just starting this research journey?
No, I mean, I completely agree with you. That's the thing that I used to. I used to myself used to think when I was a PhD student. Just a sec. I think there's something wrong with my screen now. Just a sec. Right. Yeah. So what I would suggest is that's the that's the same kind of the thought that I had, that how can I actually publish like these other researchers. Something that I would suggest is it's important to build in that good habit of writing every day if possible. So that is what I did as a PhD student, that I would have a dedicated time. So you can't be multitasking. Something that I would suggest everybody is, something that I'm doing. And also when I review papers, when I write my own papers, is I actually shut down my MS Teams chat so that I'm focused. I can't be in the chat at the same time, and I can be writing the paper at the same time. So what I would suggest is build that habit of writing papers, or writing a manuscript, or to do a bit of reading every day. So there has to be consistency, and I think that is how you will develop, in terms of as a researcher. So if I remember, when I got my first paper published. I was at a gym and I was checking my phone, and I got this, these notifications that my article was accepted, and it wasn't. I would trust me. It wasn't Q1. It was nowhere on the ABS. It was the level zero journal where I started. So what I started is starting, it's good to be optimistic. It's good to be motivated and target high ranking journals. But I think something that students need to do is put in that hard work. So you have to be dedicated and put in that hard work and do a bit of writing every day, because as you write, I think you will improve your skills. It's not that I published 1920 papers, now, but as a PhD student, I was publishing, very slowly, and my writing was not that good. So I think maintaining that consistency is very, very important.
I totally agree with you. I think the patience is virtue. You need to work constantly and then later on look for the food, right? The fruit
Yes,
itself.
yes, yes, yes,
All right.
yes.
I think we have two questions from the students. I will read out for you
Hmm.
for your ease.
Hmm.
One is from Fei Chu. Hi, Dr. Eros. How do you evaluate whether the perspective is truly new or it's just a minor variation? I think she's talking about a paper. When you read or review paper, how do you
Hmm.
judge that particular perspective?
So what I do is, as I'm reviewing the paper, as I mentioned previously, something that as a reviewer, as an associate editor, as a author myself, something that I dedicated time and that I read through is, you have to have that research gap of yours. There has to be there. I think that's the starting point. You have to clearly state that these are the research gap in the existing literature, and this is where your paper contributes to. I think that's the first step. No matter how your contribution might be minor, your contribution might be major in terms of developing theory or building theory or this and that. But what I would suggest is, not only I come across some papers that say that we are testing the scale in a new setting. So that is very limited in terms of what contribution it gives. So what my suggestion would be, a true contribution would be, starting with the research gap, clearly stating what the gap is, how do you contribute, what's your originality. You have to answer that so what question, how is it relevant. So my answer would be that, to that particular question.
I agree with you. Thank you. Next question is from Sumatya Hamajak. Uh,
Mhm.
Regarding the use of journal articles in the literature review, is it acceptable to include open access articles?
Mm, I think in response to Sumantya's question, open access articles are perfectly fine. Like, I think that is something the university here, Manchester, meant, they promote, like whenever I try to publish articles, they pay for the fees for the open access. So it's really important. Definitely you can cite open access articles. But my question, something that I tell my students time and again is build good research habits. So I have students going on to Google Scholar and they pull up a lot of stuff, and they're citing, and sometimes these are not peer reviewed, they are not credible sources. So something that I tell them is, because as they are paying for their studies here at Manchester Met, they also have access to these databases. Their fees are paying. So I tell them, if you are paying for something, why aren't you using the service? So Science Direct, Emerald Insight, Taylor and Francis, and they have these, the Mintel reports, industry reports. There are different sources, because as a reviewer, Something that I also do is look at the list of references. So if you have really, a low quality, or let's say under reviewed or non-credible sources, it gives me an impression that the researchers are not looking at credible sources. There is need for improvement. So again, that will be one of my comments in the, for the reviewers or for a PhD student, that cite credible sources, cite recent sources. So open access is fine. The thing is, cite credible sources. That's really important. Whether, it's not open access, or open access comes a bit later.
I agree. So it's more like use it with caution.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. Okay, last question from Mr. Jonathan Lai is, Dr. Eros, I have no academic background in terms of writing academic or research report articles as the jargon use. What kind of help would you suggest we should get?
Okay, so Jonathan, you mentioned that you have no academic background. So something that I would suggest is, something I'll give you I'll share something that my professor said, because when I started out my PhD, I was also a bit rushing. I was a bit rushing, and then some, and then my professors were always telling me that the idea of doing a PhD, I suppose you are doing a PhD, so something that my professors used to tell me, the idea of doing a PhD thesis or PhD research is not producing another master's thesis. It's a completely different journey. Do not rush, because I remember myself, rushing in. I had handed in, you won't believe that I had handed in 12 manuscripts in the first year of my PhD. Although I published 12 articles after 4 years, I was quite good at it, but something that I also built really good habits. So something that I would suggest is, uh, in order to write, you also need to read. So my professors would tell me, like, go on, read, go, don't come up to me with 5 articles. You have read 5 articles and you come up with an idea, don't waste my time. So something that they told me is, go back to the library, spend some quality time reading credible research, doing some of your research in terms of reviewing good literature, build that solid background. And once, I would suggest it's not about just only writing, also reading is equally important. So I think building that habit of, reading and doing, reviewing literature comes hand in hand. So in terms of writing, what I would suggest is, start slow but keep it steady. So as I was mentioning previously, you have to consistently write. Something that I also practice. Some people might think that, I publish a lot, so it might be I might be working, some days, or it's not. That's not the thing. I actually try to, write as much as possible every day, a bit little. I'm not saying that I write the whole article, but a little, reviewing new articles, trying to see what's new, and then, trying to write a bit every day. And I think that actually, I think, improves. So you can't expect yourself to be an expert quickly, but I would say it's a steady process. So you have to enjoy that process. Some students I have seen that do not actually enjoy the process. They want to reach the end with the PhD degree. I say that you are in a different field, a different, you are somewhere and not in the correct place now. You can't be doing that. No. Yeah.
I totally agree with you. Reading is the key, and then generating knowledge is the purpose of doing a PhD.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eros, for answering all the question and also sharing your insight from your experience. I'm
Mhm.
sure the students attending definitely benefited from this session. So with
Mhm.
respect of the time, thank you very much once again. And I will say thank you to all the students for joining this session. I'm sure you find it helpful. And if you have any questions, and if you want to collaborate with Dr. Eros, well, definitely you can reach out to him, right? So thank you very much, Dr. Eros, and thank you so much. That's all, end this session, right? And stay well. Okay, bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.